Stalin remained from the original leadership. Unlike Roosevelt, Truman adopted a firmer approach toward Soviet expansion. He was increasingly skeptical of Stalin's intentions in Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, Stalin believed Western governments were attempting to limit Soviet security and influence despite the enormous sacrifices made during the war. The atmosphere was noticeably colder. Disagreements over Germany's future, reparations, and Eastern Europe became more intense. Although agreements were reached on some issues, trust between the former allies continued to erode. The partnership that had defeated Nazi Germany was beginning to crack. Neither side declared war. Neither side fired a shot. Yet both increasingly viewed the other as the greatest threat to future peace. The Cold War had not officially begun. But its foundations had already been laid. The celebrations marking the end of World War II faded quickly. Across Europe, people dreamed of rebuilding their homes, reuniting with their families, and creating a future free from fear. But behind the scenes, political tensions were growing stronger with every passing month. The alliance between the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union had been built on a common goal: defeating Nazi Germany. Once that goal was achieved, the deep differences that had always existed between them could no longer be ignored. Joseph Stalin had one overriding concern: security. The Soviet Union had suffered more than any other major power during the war. Entire cities had been destroyed, millions of soldiers had been killed, and countless civilians had lost their lives. Stalin believed that if another invasion from the West ever occurred, it could mean the end of the Soviet Union. To prevent that from happening, he wanted a buffer zone of friendly governments between the Soviet Union and Western Europe. Soviet forces had already liberated much of Eastern Europe from Nazi occupation, and Stalin intended to keep a strong influence over those countries. At first, many Western leaders understood the Soviet desire for security. But as months passed, it became clear that Stalin was doing more than protecting his borders. Communist parties, backed by Moscow, began taking control in countries such as Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and later Czechoslovakia. Opposition parties were weakened, elections were manipulated, and governments increasingly followed Soviet policies. To the Soviet leadership, these changes were necessary for national security. To the United States and Britain, they looked like the expansion of communist control across Europe. The disagreement soon became impossible to ignore. In March 1946, former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill traveled to the United States to deliver a speech that would become one of the most famous in modern history. Standing before an audience in Fulton, Missouri, Churchill declared that an Iron Curtain had descended across the European continent. The phrase immediately captured the world's attention. Churchill was not describing a physical wall. Instead, he was describing an invisible political boundary separating Eastern Europe, where Soviet influence was growing, from Western Europe, where democratic governments and capitalist economies remained in place. The words reflected what millions of people were already beginning to fear. Europe was no longer united. It was being divided into two opposing worlds. The Soviet Union strongly rejected Churchill's speech. Stalin accused him of promoting hostility and preparing the West for another conflict. Soviet newspapers described the speech as dangerous propaganda designed to turn public opinion against the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, in Washington, American leaders were becoming increasingly concerned about Soviet actions. President Harry S. Truman believed that if communist influence continued expanding unchecked, more countries might eventually fall under Soviet control. This concern shaped a new direction in American foreign policy. In 1947, Truman announced what became known as the Truman Doctrine. Its message was simple but powerful. The United States would support countries threatened by communist movements or outside pressure from the Soviet Union. The first major tests came in Greece and Turkey. Greece was facing a civil war between the government and communist rebels, while Turkey faced growing Soviet pressure over control of important waterways connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Rather than sending American soldiers into combat, the United States provided financial assistance, military equipment, and economic aid. Truman argued that helping these nations remain independent would prevent the spread of communism and contribute to global stability. The announcement marked a turning point. For the first time, the United States openly committed itself to containing Soviet influence around the world. The Soviet Union viewed the policy very differently. To Moscow, it appeared that the United States was interfering in the internal affairs of other nations and attempting to surround the Soviet Union with governments loyal to Washington. The rivalry between the two superpowers was becoming increasingly global. Economic recovery soon became another battlefield. Europe's economy was in ruins. Factories stood silent, transportation networks were broken, and food shortages affected millions. American officials feared that poverty and instability could make communist movements more attractive to desperate populations. In response, the United States launched the Marshall Plan in 1948. Named after Secretary of State George C. Marshall, the program offered billions of dollars in financial aid to help rebuild war-torn European countries. The assistance funded new factories, repaired railways, rebuilt roads, restored agriculture, and revived trade. Nations such as France, Italy, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Agriculture and economic planning. Stalin believed that socialism offered protection against inequality and foreign aggression. Neither side trusted the other. In fact, suspicion had existed long before World War II. After the Russian Revolution of 1917, many Western governments viewed communist ideology as a direct threat. Likewise, Soviet leaders believed capitalist countries hoped to destroy the communist state before it could succeed. The alliance during World War II had been built on necessity. Once their common enemy was defeated, old fears quickly returned. Even before Germany surrendered, Allied leaders met several times to discuss what the post-war world should look like. One of the most important meetings took place in February 1945 at Yalta, located on the Crimean Peninsula. Three powerful leaders gathered around the negotiating table. American President Franklin D. Roosevelt, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. Each arrived with different priorities. Roosevelt hoped to secure Soviet cooperation in defeating Japan and wanted international organizations that could prevent future wars. Churchill worried about preserving democratic governments across Europe and protecting Britain's remaining influence. Stalin focused on security. The Soviet Union had suffered unimaginable losses during the German invasion. More than 20 million Soviet citizens had died during the war. Entire cities had been destroyed, and vast regions had become battlefields. Stalin believed another invasion from the West must never happen again. To achieve this, he wanted friendly governments along the Soviet Union's western border. These countries would serve as a protective buffer against future attacks. At Yalta, the leaders agreed that Germany would be divided into occupation zones controlled by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Berlin, although located deep inside the Soviet occupation zone, would revealed the systematic murder of 6 million Jews, alongside millions of other victims, including Roma people, disabled individuals, political prisoners, and countless others deemed undesirable by Adolf Hitler's regime. For many survivors, liberation did not immediately bring happiness. Entire families had disappeared. Homes no longer existed. Communities had vanished forever. Across Europe, millions of refugees wandered through devastated landscapes searching for relatives, food, and shelter. Many had no country to return to. Others found their hometowns occupied by different governments or transformed beyond recognition. The war had ended. The suffering had not. Before the war, several nations competed for global influence. Britain controlled a vast empire stretching across continents. France remained one of Europe's strongest powers. Germany had attempted to dominate Europe through military conquest, while Japan sought control across Asia. By 1945, everything had changed. Britain emerged victorious but financially exhausted. Years of war had drained its economy, leaving enormous debts and weakening its ability to maintain its global empire. France faced similar challenges. Large parts of the country required reconstruction, and political instability threatened its recovery. Germany lay defeated and occupied. Japan had surrendered after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Only two nations emerged stronger than before: the United States and the Soviet Union. Although both had fought together against Nazi Germany, they represented completely different political and economic systems. The United States believed in democracy, competitive elections, private businesses, and capitalism. American leaders argued that free markets and political freedoms offered the best path toward prosperity and stability. The Soviet Union promoted communism under the leadership of Joseph Stalin. The Soviet government controlled Motor Industry. September 1945. The guns had finally fallen silent. After 6 years of destruction unlike anything humanity had ever witnessed, the Second World War came to an end. Across Europe and Asia, millions celebrated what they believed was the beginning of a peaceful new era. Soldiers returned home, families reunited, and cities slowly emerged from the smoke and rubble. But beneath the celebrations, another conflict was already taking shape. It would not begin with tanks crossing borders or bombers filling the skies. Instead, it would unfold through political speeches, secret intelligence operations, nuclear weapons, economic rivalry, and competing visions for the future of humanity. The world had defeated one enemy. Now, two former allies were preparing to confront each other. This was the beginning of the Cold War. The end of World War II did not simply mark the defeat of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. It left behind a world that was physically, economically, and emotionally shattered. Entire cities across Europe had been reduced to rubble. Historic capitals that had stood for centuries were scarred by relentless bombing campaigns. Roads, bridges, railways, factories, schools, and hospitals had been destroyed on an unimaginable scale. In Germany, neighborhoods had disappeared beneath mountains of broken concrete and twisted steel. In Poland, Warsaw had been almost completely destroyed after years of occupation and fierce fighting. Across France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Italy, and the Soviet Union, rebuilding would take decades. The human cost was even more staggering. Historians estimate that between 70 and 85 million people lost their lives during the war. Soldiers died on battlefields stretching from North Africa to the Pacific Islands, while millions of civilians became victims of bombings, starvation, forced labor, disease, and genocide. The Holocaust exposed horrors that shocked the entire world. Nazi concentration and extermination camps. Also be divided among the four Allied powers. The conference ended with optimistic public statements. But beneath the smiles for photographers, disagreements were growing. What exactly did free elections mean? Who would decide the governments of Eastern Europe? How much influence should the Soviet Union have over neighboring countries? These questions remained unresolved. Only months later, they would become major sources of conflict. When Germany officially surrendered on May 8, 1945, there was no functioning national government. The Nazi regime had collapsed completely. The Allied powers took direct control of the country. Germany was divided into four military occupation zones. American forces governed the south. British forces administered the northwest. French authorities controlled the southwest. The Soviet Union occupied eastern Germany. Each occupying power introduced different policies. In the western zones, democratic institutions slowly began to reappear. Local governments were rebuilt, newspapers reopened under supervision, and political parties gradually returned. In the Soviet zone, communist leaders gained increasing influence. Land reforms redistributed property, industries were nationalized, and political opposition became increasingly restricted. At first, Allied leaders claimed these arrangements were temporary. But with each passing month, cooperation became more difficult. Germany was no longer simply a defeated nation. It had become the center of an ideological struggle between East and West. While Europe struggled to recover, world leaders hoped to prevent another global catastrophe. The failure of the League of Nations after World War I remained fresh in everyone's memory. This time, governments wanted a stronger international organization. In October 1945, the United Nations officially came into existence. Its goals were ambitious. Maintain international peace. Promote cooperation between nations. Protect human rights. Provide humanitarian assistance. Encourage economic development. The organization established the Security Council, giving permanent seats to 5 major powers: the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, France, and China. Each received the power to veto major decisions. Many believed the United Nations would guarantee lasting peace. Yet the organization faced an immediate challenge. Its 2 most powerful members increasingly viewed each other as rivals instead of partners. This rivalry would shape nearly every major international crisis for decades. The final months of World War II introduced a weapon unlike anything ever created. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, another bomb struck Nagasaki. The destruction stunned the world. Entire neighborhoods vanished within seconds. Intense heat, shockwaves, and radiation killed tens of thousands almost instantly, while many more died from injuries and radiation sickness in the following months. Japan surrendered shortly afterward. The war had ended. But a new era had begun. For the first time in history, humanity possessed weapons capable of destroying entire cities in moments. The United States initially held a monopoly on nuclear weapons. This gave Washington enormous military and political influence. However, Soviet scientists immediately accelerated their own nuclear research. Stalin understood that as long as only one nation possessed atomic weapons, the balance of global power would remain dangerously unequal. The race had already begun. It would become one of the defining features of the Cold War. In July 1945, Allied leaders met once again. This time, the conference took place in Potsdam, near Berlin. Much had changed since Yalta. Franklin Roosevelt had died and was replaced by President Harry S. Truman. Britain elected a new Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, during the conference itself. Only Joseph accepted the aid, helping their economies recover far more quickly than many had expected. The Soviet Union, however, saw the Marshall Plan as a political strategy rather than a humanitarian effort. Stalin argued that American financial assistance would allow Washington to dominate European economies and influence their governments. As a result, the Soviet Union refused the aid and pressured Eastern European countries to reject it as well. The economic division of Europe became almost as significant as its political division. Western Europe increasingly prospered with American investment. Eastern Europe remained closely tied to the Soviet-controlled economic system. By the late 1940s, the hopes of lasting cooperation between the wartime allies had nearly disappeared. The United States and the Soviet Union were no longer simply powerful nations with different political systems. They had become rivals competing for influence, allies, technology, military strength, and global leadership. Although no direct war had broken out between them, every decision, every speech, and every alliance deepened the growing divide. The Cold War was no longer just a possibility. It had become the defining reality of the post-war world. By 1948, the Cold War had become impossible to ignore. One of its first major crises erupted in Berlin. Although the city was located deep inside Soviet-controlled East Germany, it was divided among the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. In June 1948, the Soviet Union blocked all roads, railways, and canals leading into West Berlin, hoping to force the Western Allies out of the city. Instead of giving up, the United States and its allies launched the Berlin Airlift. For nearly a year, cargo planes delivered food, medicine, coal, and other essential supplies to more than 2 million people. The operation succeeded, and in May 1949, the blockade was lifted. That same year, Western nations formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, a military alliance built on the promise that an attack on one member would be considered an attack on all. In response, the Soviet Union later created its own alliance, the Warsaw Pact, dividing Europe into two armed camps. The rivalry intensified when the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb in 1949, ending America's monopoly on nuclear weapons. From that moment, both superpowers entered a dangerous nuclear arms race, each building larger and more powerful arsenals. Although the United States and the Soviet Union never fought each other directly, their competition shaped global politics for decades through proxy wars, espionage, space exploration, and ideological rivalry. World War II had ended in 1945, but the struggle for global influence had only just begun. The Cold War would define the second half of the 20th century, leaving a lasting impact on international relations that can still be felt today.